Hello, this is David Neal, Northwest Coast native artist and storyteller, and this is the origin story of Raven. In the early days of the world, there was a great chief who had a beautiful wife, whom he loved very much. But she was unfaithful, and one day the chief's servant saw her meeting her lover, and her treachery was discovered. The servant went to the chief and told him what he had seen. The chief was heartbroken, and he shunned his wife. Not long afterwards, she gave birth to a child, and everyone in the village knew that her lover was the father, and they would have nothing to do with her. The woman stayed in the back of the big house with the baby and cried for days. Then she had an idea, and she decided to feign her own death. Late one evening, after everyone had gone to sleep, she went to see a wicked shaman who lived in the forest not far from the village. He was not known for healing like most shamans, but for practicing the dark arts. She gave him her precious otter robe in payment, and the evil shaman gave her a potent mixture of herbs in return. The next day she was found dead, still holding her illegitimate child, who was still alive. No one wanted to care for the infant, so they both were taken to the burial house in the forest. But she had told her lover of her duplicitous plan, and in the evening after dark he went to see her. The chief's slave, who liked to walk in the forest, saw the man sneak into the burial house and told his master. The chief was incredulous and didn't believe the slave, but he went to see for himself and caught the plotting wife and her young lover. When the chief arrived, the lover fled and left the terrified wife and the infant son. In a rage, he killed his wife and left the baby, which should have been the end of the tale. But the baby did not die and grew to be a young boy in just a few days. A few days later, the village children were playing bow and arrows, and one of the bows and a quiver of arrows went missing. Later, the orphan boy was seen playing with it in the forest. One of the children went to tell the chief, who sent his slave to see if it was true. The girl led the slave into the damp, dark forest, and he was amazed to discover the orphan child had grown to the size of a 6-year-old boy in just a few days. He returned to tell the chief of the miraculous thing that he had seen. The chief knew that the infant was supernatural and had been brought to the house to live with his family, and he took him as his son. The boy soon became pals with one of the village children, and they played together all the time and became close friends. One day, the chief's son told his friend that he wanted to visit the chief in the sky world, Kantsoamp. So the next day, they shot a thrush and a woodpecker. They skinned them, and the chief's son took each skin with the feathers still attached and stretched them until they were large enough to be worn. Then he put on the bird garments, and they were transformed and were able to fly. As the sun began to set in the west, they put on the bird garments, and they were transformed into a thrush and a woodpecker. Then they flew high up into the sky. After flying for a long time, they arrived in the sky world, and found that it looked very much like the world below. They flew on until they reached the house of the chief of the sky world, and came to rest at a pond nearby. Soon the chief's daughter came to the pond to get water, and discovered the two birds drinking from the pond. She tried to shoo them away, but they would not go, and so she assumed that they were tame. Very gently she picked them up, hid them under a blanket, and took them into her house. She went into her room and set them down on a cedar box. Then the boys took off the bird garments and transformed into their human form. At first the woman was shocked to find two young men where there had been birds, but the chief's son was handsome. He smiled and asked her to be his wife, and she found that she could only agree. Her father heard the talking and asked who she was speaking to. She replied that there was a young man who wanted to be her husband. The chief of the sky world told them to join him at the fire. The daughter warned the boys that there were spikes in the floor, and they would be impaled by them when they tried to walk across the floor. Other suitors had been killed this way, she explained. The chief's son said that he wasn't afraid, and he set off towards the fire, sliding his feet rather than lifting them so that he pushed the spikes aside as he walked. The chief was impressed because all the other suitors had been killed by the spikes, and he realized that this boy must have supernatural power, so he allowed him to stay and marry his daughter. Soon they were wed, and in time they had a baby boy. But they were ill-fated, and one day the baby slipped from the mother's hands and fell to the world below. It splashed into the sea not far from the village where his grandfather was chief. About that time the chief sent a slave to the beach to gather driftwood for the fire, and he had seen the child floating near the shore, so he waded into the water and carried him to the shore. He was astounded to find that the baby was alive and seemed to be in good health, so he took him to the big house. The chief wasn't aware that the infant was his grandson, but he understood that the baby must be hungry, so he asked his sister, who was nursing her own young baby, to feed the newborn child. She tried to give him milk, but the baby refused it, and no one knew what to do. There was an elder in the village, a very old man, that everyone knew to be very wise, so the chief sent for him. The elder examined the baby, and after several minutes he said that the infant wanted to eat fish, asked for fresh fish to be brought. He cut out the stomachs of the fish and gave them to the baby, who ate them greedily and then cried for more. Then he gave him the rest of the fish, which he ate ravenously. He cried again, so he gave him dried berries with fish grease, and he ate that as well. And he kept eating, growing larger as he ate until he had eaten everything in the house. When all the food was gone, he said, "Don't you know me? I am Raven." Then he went outside and started eating the food in the other house of the village. The people realized this child was truly supernatural, and they grew afraid. They packed their belongings, loaded their canoes, and moved away from the village and left Raven by himself. Raven stayed in the village until every morsel of food was gone, and then he left in search of food and adventures. The villagers never seen Raven again, but they heard of his exploits.